Hello, welcome to Podfic Galore. I'm your horrible online reader, Grossgasteiger. I read out loud fan fictions for you busy bees, free of charge and no strings attached. Today, I will continue reading the Silmarillion / Lord of the Rings fic by Bloodwing Blackbird from Archive of Our Own called And Now Each Night I Count the Stars. I hope you can at least try to enjoy my voice, and I will try my best for you with the equipment available to me. Note, this fic is rated explicit. On with the show. And now each night I count the stars. Chapter 4. In the morning, Haman showed Mugler to the smithy. Having nothing better to do, Halbarad followed along. The forge was cold and dusty, with the reek of old smoke heavy in the air, but Mugler seemed satisfied. This will do. Did Wymond not have an apprentice? Oh, aye, young Maddie. Sharp enough, but a bit flighty still. She was ready to take over the place. Her mother took ill last winter, you understand. And is her mother well now? She is. And Maddie would like to continue her apprenticeship? For a week at least? I expect so. Now, I should warn you, she's a fair trickster, our Maddie. Mugler lifted an eyebrow. If she can swing a hammer, then she'll do. In her best, I'd expect. Hammond looked doubtful. He hovered in the entry, twisting his hat between his hands. Mugler cleared his throat. Go get her, then? Ah, right. Halbarad snorted and found himself a stool in the corner. He had found a nice bit of wood and had thought that maybe he'd carve a spoon of it, but he couldn't find his knife, his old one with the split handle and broken tip. Well, no great loss after all. Soon enough, he was distracted by Mugler, who had already lit the coals and was working the bellows. Halbarad wasn't sure why he was surprised by the ease with which Mugler had gone about it at all, but there had been a doubtful little voice at the back of his head all the same. He decided that it was probably better to simply give up on having any expectations of Mugler, for good or for ill. Mugler was braiding his habitually unkempt hair out of his way when Haman returned with the girl in tow and looked at the fire in wonder. "You're as good as a dwarf, if you don't mind me saying." Halbarad nodded in agreement. "Would you believe that he's had me making the campfires all this time?" "You needed the practice," said Mugler. He waved the apprentice over. "Maddie?" "Aye, sir." The lass had hung back behind Haman, but she stepped forward readily enough. She had a round, friendly face and a great cloud of dark curls. "I gather there's work to be done. Show me what you know, and we'll see if I can add anything to it." Maddie grinned wide at that, showing a gap between her front teeth. "Oh, I got a few tricks for you, I wager." While Haman went to retrieve Daffodil, Halbarad abandoned the search for his knife and lit a pipe. Halbarad would have said that he was watching because he was worried, though it did not escape his notice that Mugler could be a daunting figure, especially like this. He and Maddie had been making nails, jigs, small incidentals to get used to working together, little things that they might need as they went. He had stripped to the waist to spare his borrowed tunic, leaving only the cloth that bound his chest, and Halbarad found himself trying to make sense of the map of scars across the wiry muscles of his arms and shoulders. Halbarad had the strangest feeling that he was seeing Mugler for the first time, from the way his scar twisted his lips into something that could almost be mistaken for a smile, to the smooth, confident strength and the deceptive softness in his grip as he handled the tools. He had not much fear that the girl would come to any real harm under Mugler's watch, but he also could not say that he trusted Mugler to keep civil. He needn't have worried. Though the farmer had called the girl flighty, she was quick-witted and diligent, for all that Mugler seemed dismayed by her high spirits. He was never cruel, though Halbarad could not, perhaps, have called him kind. Mugler had spent far too much time on his own company to ever be anything other than abrupt, and yet Halbarad had the strangest thought that he might be enjoying himself. For her part, Maddie seemed to think that the elf was quite a comical fellow. His dour manner did not discourage her, indeed. She seemed determined to provoke him as much as she could without impacting their work. While they shaped horseshoes, she tried to teach him body rhymes and delighted in mimicking his gruff tone and faint accent when she echoed his instructions back to him. Mugler stonily ignored this, but Halbarad thought he saw the shadow of a smile cross those thin, scarred lips when Maddie wasn't looking. It took no time at all for word to spread in the village that there was a blacksmith at work, and the inhabitants of the surrounding area started to appear bearing an assortment of tools and household goods that had been neglected since the old smith's illness, along with several workhorses who, like Daffodil, needed shoeing. A few brought a copper penny, or a pack of wheat, or a jug of wine. Makler passed a couple of pennies over to Halbarad, the rest he gave to Maddie, except for the wine, which he kept. Many had nothing, but none were turned away. After the first day, Halbarad spent his days walking about the village, gathering what news he could, but sometimes he came back to the forge to watch them work. At night, they slept in Haman's barn, cows chewing sleepily above them. Or rather, Halbarad did. After the first day, Makler stayed at the smithy nights, long after Maddie had gone home to her family. He did not speak of what he was making, and Halbarad had not the courage to ask. He had made the mistake of asking a question on the first day, almost without thinking. I suppose your father taught you smithing? It had been an obvious conclusion, but apparently an incorrect one, or at least not one that should have been voiced. Makler dropped the piece of iron they had been working on. The clatter of it was sharp enough to make Halbarad jump. Maddie dropped her hammer and took a step back. Speak not to me of my father. Makler threw his hammer onto the anvil and yanked off the heavy leather glove. He stalked toward the door. I never learned anything from him but cruelty. The smithy felt very silent after that. Maddie glanced at Halbarad, then very deliberately went back to her work. Makler returned quickly enough, and they spoke no more of it. In this way, the week passed. The last night of their stay happened to coincide with a festival. The folk of Archet called it the Day of Waters, and everywhere that Halbarad went, the villagers were busily cleaning, laundering their clothes, washing the walls, even grooming the old draft horses, all now freshly shod. Buffs of fragrant conifers were hung in the windows, and doorways were decorated with ribbons. In the evening, the entire village, all freshly bathed and dressed in their finest, gathered in the center of the town for merrymaking. It was a hungry time of year, so there was little feasting, only stew of venison and turnip, but wine flowed freely and the young folk were rowdy. Maddie ran up to Halbarad and pushed a cup of local, oversweet wine into his hands. She wore a wreath of cedar in her hair, and her dark eyes sparkled. Is your friend a-coming? She asked as he drank. My friend? He started to laugh at that, although whether at the notion that he and Makler were friends, or that the idea of Makler at a village festival, I very much doubt it. I think you know where he can be found. She looked heavenward. Oh, of course. Come on, then. Where are we going? Why, to fetch him. All of this guiding will make him miserable. Don't tell me you don't want to see his face. She grabbed his hand and tugged him in the direction of the smithy. The door was dark, standing open, the forge cold. Master Blackbird, she called. Halbarad's first thought was that he'd been wrong about everything. Makler was not here. He had no reason to have any loyalty to Halbarad, and he was probably fled from this place, back to his wandering. Halbarad didn't understand why the thought didn't make him angrier. While he had frozen at the door, trying desperately to make sense of his sudden sadness, Maddie had fairly skipped inside. Found ya! She clucked her tongue. You'll ruin your eyes working in the dark like that. Did you She stopped herself, perhaps remembering how he had reacted to mention of his father. Never mind. What are you making? Halbarad could not hear Makler's response. Oh, keep your secrets if you must. Come out now, though. You'll miss the jugglers. I've work to finish. Still, Makler let himself be pulled from the table where he had sat, hidden in the corner, quickly tucking something away in his sleeves when he saw Halbarad. There's a festival, Halbarad said unnecessarily. There's a festival and we must leave tomorrow. It was hardly a complete thought, but what should have come next he couldn't say, for it might have been, so come dance with me. The look that Makler gave him seemed to see too much. Yes, I suppose it's time. He noticed Maddie watching him and put a hand, gloved again, on her shoulder. I'll miss ya, she said. You're a right satisfactory smith. You're a right satisfactory apprentice, he replied. Indeed, You'll make a finer smith than I ever did. You know all that you need to take over the place already. Don't let the folk here tell you otherwise.
"'Tis true," Halbarad added. "Folk will talk about the sweet woman of Archet for hundreds of miles."
Maddie sniffed and threw her arms around him, then turned to Maglar, who sagged in relief when she offered him a hand instead. Even so, it took almost a jug of wine in addition to physical force, one tuck in each of his arms, to convince Maglar. It was full dark, and the stars shone as the crowd enfolded them. Some of the townsfolk had brought out instruments and were standing atop of the table playing a tune that Halbarad had never heard. Maddie knew it, though, and was soon singing at the top of her lungs along with the rest of the villagers. Maglar seemed to feel that he had humored them sufficiently. He shrugged them both off and settled himself a seat where the firelight did not reach. He pulled up his hood, took a long draught of the wine, and glared balefully at Halbarad, who had likely had too much drink already, for he found the sight dreadfully funny. He let himself be pulled back into the dance, looking back at the elf, at his friend, ever so often. Each time, he found himself watched, and so he performed for his audience. He leapt and spun, twirling ungracefully through the men and women of Archet. They laughed at his clumsiness as they took his hands, and when the song ended, a pretty lass grabbed him and kissed him hard on the cheek. He laughed and patted her waist and shook his head when she leaned close and asked him questions. She danced away with a shrug and a smile, and Halbarad glanced over to Maglar, who looked away quickly, whatever expression he had worn before hidden away. It was probably foolish, but Halbarad had a sudden thought that he must be lonely over there. It was the sort of idea born of too much wine, but it was only the work of a moment to dash unsteadily back to the smithy and find the harp. He felt a bit strange handling it, for it was an ancient thing, and beautiful, carved with 8-petaled flowers of the bloodroot, with birds, with stars. He carried it carefully back to the festival and approached Maglar from behind.
"Making friends?"
"Only with the wine," replied Maglar, filling another cup. "I do not belong here."
"Would you like a companion?"
"And here I thought that you didn't care for—" Maglar turned and stared at Halbarad, at the harp in his hands.
"I missed your playing this week."
"You're mocking me," Maglar accused, but there was little force behind the words. He watched the musicians for a moment. "I do not know their songs."
"Seems a fine time to learn."
Maglar stared, as if Halbarad was a puzzle that he could not solve. Something in him seemed to soften. "My thanks, Dunedain," he said softly before he drained his cup and took up the harp. "Oh, Halbarad, have you ever been told that you dance like a drunken bull?" Halbarad set his chin in his hands and plastered an attentive look on his face. Maglar shook his head and stepped into the light with his harp. The fiddler noticed him first and elbowed the fellow next to him. With a bit of shuffling, they had made room and waved Maglar over. Halbarad thought he looked uncertain, perhaps even bashful, as he clasped the men's hands to climb onto the tabletop. After a brief whispered conversation, they began to play. Maglar followed the tune as if it were one he had known all his life, though it was hardly like the elven lays that Halbarad had heard him play. This was closer, quicker, and it sounded like spring. The villagers whirled into another great dance, and Halbarad was caught up in their wake, his head a-whirl with hands and bodies and music. The merrymaking went on until the full moon shone high above them. A suspicious number of young folk had disappeared in pairs to do the sorts of things that young folk do by the time that the dancers had stopped and music faded to silence. The ranger and the elf were both clumsy with drink and weariness as they stumbled down the track to Hamon's farm. "Stop. Hold a moment." Maglar plucked at Halbarad's sleeve. Halbarad spun around and caught Maglar by the forearms, whirling them both about. One of the young folk had placed a wreath of juniper on Maglar's brow. He still wore this, and his dark eyes seemed very bright beneath it. He smelled of the woods and of the fire, and maybe Halbarad had drunk enough wine to be foolish.
"See? Not so bad to dance with me, is it? At least not when the moon looks like that."
He waved his arm above. Maglar planted his feet so that Halbarad fumbled to a stop. "Now, if you're finished, may I borrow your knife?" Halbarad frowned, patting at his belt. trying to find the worn old camp knife.
Have you lost your own?
He asked, wondering if he had perhaps left it behind somewhere, but no. He had been missing it for a few days, hadn't he? No great loss, perhaps, but Hal had been fond of that blade, broken though it was. Maeder stopped him, holding something out to him. A knife. Halbara took it and pulled it from the leather sheath held it up to moonlight. It was sharp as a whisper, and the steel had been folded such that it made a pattern of waves along the blade.
What is this? He asked.
Your knife.
Nah, this is not my knife. My knife is broken. He ran his thumb along the blade and hissed when it drew blood.
It is your knife, Maeder said. I took it from you a week ago.
You stole my knife?
Halbara wondered, as if it were only the drink that made this conversation flow so strangely. Yes.
But you have a knife.
I wanted yours.
And then you fixed it?
Fixing was a small word for it, but Halbara could not think of one better. Yes?
Thank you.
It is only a small thing.
Wait, 1 moment.
Halbara pulled out his purse and retrieved one of the penny pieces.
Here.
Maeder frowned. It is a gift. Also, it's still your own knife.
No, this is important. It's something my father used to say. An old superstition, I suppose.
Halbara straightened and looked until Maeder met his eyes. He said that one should only sell a knife, never give one as a gift, lest it cut the friendship. Maeder's voice was very serious when he asked, Are we friends then, Halbara? Halbara considered.
I think we may be.
I think that you may be a fool, Halbara. Maeder held out his hand, and Halbara dropped the penny into it. But for myself, I'm glad. When Halbara woke, the barn was empty, save for Hamon's animals. It was early, the light shining through the entry, still dim and grey. His head ached, and he took a moment to regret every decision that had led him to this place. Before he could truly bestir himself, a shadow stepped across the light. Maeder stood tall and serious again. I have been to the forge. All will be well there. Halbara yawned at him.
How long have you been awake?
Long enough to finish things that needed doing. I'm only awaiting you. With that, he left Halbara to wipe the sleep from his eyes. A foggy morning greeted Halbara beyond the barn. He navigated towards the sound of voices and found Hamon and his family gathered around Maeder. He was cloaked again for travel, a scarf wrapped around his face against the fog. As he drew closer, Halbara realized that it had not been only his knife that had kept Maeder at the forge all night every night. Maeder had carried a staff since they met him in Bree, and Halbara had not thought of anything other than a walking stick until he had seen Maeder fight with it. It had proven dangerous enough as a quarterstaff, but now it was tipped with a single-edged blade, carefully shaped but cruel, with a small hook on the reverse for pulling down riders. He had blackened the metal, but the point of the blade glinted in sunlight. This is Morinel, he explained, seeing Halbara's look. The children were as unimpressed with the glaive as they were undaunted by Maeder's manner, and were busy handing him small mementos, rocks, bits of string, and buttons. These last he passed back to Hamon's wife when the children weren't looking. In return, she had given several skins of wine, some salt pork, and a few of the remaining apples. Laden with gifts, they left the village of Archet and marched into the fog. The days progressed, and a rainstorm washed the fog away, only to reveal that it hadn't hidden much. It was still too early to see much sign of spring beyond the mud that continued to plague them, though it would likely change ere the end of their journey. As the days wore on and the foothills of the misty mountains began to lurk behind the clouds near the horizon, Maeder sank again into silence. Halbara had already learned a lesson about asking unwanted questions, but Maeder was his friend now, and he worried at the change. One night, just east of the Horwell, Maeder spoke as they sat beside the embers of their fire. March was fast fading, and the woods beside the road were full of flowers. Snowdrops, hepatica, orchids all dotted the path. The gardens of Rivendell would soon be a riot of birds and blossoms. You called me cruel. It took Halbara a breath to realize that Maeder was speaking to him, for he had again become accustomed to silence between them.
Yes,
he said at length.
I did. proud too, if I remember right.
Makler nodded. That is not why I... He paused in that thought and changed direction. I suppose you think I have behaved childishly.
Perhaps.
You are right. It was not a confession that Halbarad had expected to hear. He said not, though. I think I am afraid.
Of what?
To evil end shall all things turn that they begin well, and by treason of kin unto kin, and the fear of treason shall this come to pass, he recited, as if it were a statement that lived ever at the forefront of his mind. That is the doom that was laid on me, or part of it.
You are afraid of being betrayed?
At that, Makler laughed aloud.
No, Halbarad.
It is not what others may do to me that I fear. It is the evil that I'm fated to bring about.
And that is why you've been hiding since the end of the first age?
That brought to mind a question that had bothered Halbarad.
Did you ever wander the shores of Middle-earth, singing regretfully ever after?
I spent a few centuries at it. Long enough to cultivate the rumors, I suppose.
Do you want to know what I think?
I expect I'll regret asking, but please, go on.
I think that all this is an excuse. This doom, this tragic survivor of a doomed house, this wounded pride. You say that nothing you do can come to good, because then you can do nothing. If you are doomed to hurt those around you, then you are safe from their love, from the responsibility that comes with living in the world. You're not afraid of their blame, but the prospect of their forgiveness frightens you, because to live in a world, you must make choices. And I think that you're afraid to do that. Because that would be to admit that you had a choice all along, and that you chose wrong.
It had been much more that he had meant to say, but something about it upset him.
I fear no punishment, said Makler.
Halbarad shook his head.
I think that you're quite skilled enough at punishing yourself. I think that you're afraid to be forgiven.
The silence in the camp had never felt heavier, but Halbarad went on.
I think that you're afraid of being forgiven, because you would again have to be part of the world.
Makler said nothing,
still staring into the fire when Halbarad gave up on ever hearing a response to his speechifying and rolled himself into his cloak.
End of chapter 4. Stay tuned.